Welcome back, everybody. So today we're going to start our discussion of the digestive system in earnest by looking at the overall functions and processes that occur in the digestive system, really focusing on how things are broken down in order to be absorbed into the body and useful for metabolism and anabolism and other processes. In the previous unit, I talked about sort of general processes and conceptual links between the digestive and respiratory system. So I want to start our discussion of digestion by making links between digestion and metabolism, because there's a lot of similarities in these two processes, and they're clearly linked together in the breakdown and utilization of nutrients. And so the specific thing I want to highlight is that both metabolism and digestion are involved in chemical reactions. So they're ultimately breaking chemical bonds, atomic bonds, to change the molecular structure of different chemicals within the body. So if we look at digestion, this breakdown has a very specific goal, and it's to break down the large molecules or polymers, if we think about macromolecules, which is what we generally think of when we think of digestion, and ultimately allow them to be absorbed into the body. And so these large molecules provide metabolic fuel for energy production, so cellular respiration. They're also the building blocks for molecular synthesis or anabolism. And then they also provide vitamins necessary for reactions and minerals responsible for physiological processes. And we've talked about a lot of these minerals already, and then the vitamins are often integrated into enzymes and other structures that support physiological processes. Metabolism takes the products from these digestive reactions that break down these polymers or large molecules into individual monomers. So it takes these small molecules and then it uses them either to produce energy in the form of ATP or to synthesize larger molecules from these smaller components. And so digestion is providing this fuel in the building blocks, and the metabolism is actually what's using them. And it's also interconverting these macromolecules or vitamins. And then we also have the minerals that are being used, although those aren't directly used in metabolism. And as a reminder, a lot of this is happening within the cell. So at the very microscopic level, within the mitochondria, or within different synthesis structures like the endoplasmic reticulum, where protein synthesis or lipid production occurs. And so as a framework for really thinking about the links between digestion and metabolism, cellular respiration, this process of converting sugar, glucose, and combining it with the oxygen to produce ATP, energy, and also carbon dioxide and water as waste products is really central to thinking about this link. And so we've already gone through part of this. We've talked about how oxygen is acquired by the respiratory system, and how the respiratory system excretes carbon dioxide. And here now we're going to look at actually how this process occurs, where the oxygen is important, where the glucose or sugars come from, and how this glucose is created from other macronutrient sources, specifically fats and lipids, or not necessarily glucose, but other catabolic reactants. But let's return to the digestive system proper. So if we think about the major function of the digestive system, it's to internalize nutrients, and these nutrients would include minerals and vitamins, but I'm thinking nutrients more in terms of organic molecules, and then minerals, things like ions and vitamins, which are important components, also organic, but not actually used for energy. And specifically, contrasting it with the respiratory system, the digestive system is internalizing liquids. So here we have our glass of water, and also solids in the form of food. And ultimately, this is going into a liquid form in the body into the bloodstream. So here we have a bag of blood plasma, and this is where these nutrients and minerals will ultimately end up in order to be circulated around the body. And so if we look at a diagram or a flow chart of how this works, we have food intake, and we have proteins, complex carbohydrates, and triglycerides that make up the bulk of the food. So these are our macronutrients right here, our complex polymers of different smaller building blocks. And then ultimately, these are broken down into their smaller components. So for instance, amino acids, which make proteins, glucose, which is an example of a monomer of a carbohydrate or a polysaccharide, So glucose is a monosaccharide. And then finally, our triglycerides, which are fatty molecules. And then we would break that down into the components of glycerol and fatty acids. And then once these are in the body, metabolism takes hold here with these green arrows. And then we have sort of the breakdown for energy, or we have conversion, interconversion of these different molecules into building blocks if we're breaking it down in the body. So we have our anabolic and catabolic reactions that are occurring, and then these are supporting body function. But in order to get these molecules that support the catabolism and anabolism, hence metabolism as a whole, it first needs to get into the body in the form of monomers. So this is achieved by breaking these large nutrients, these complex carbohydrates, these proteins, these fats into their molecular components. So imagine food comes into the gut as a large bolus, and then ultimately it gets converted into these individual monomers, which are then able to move or be transported through the cell membranes of the intestinal lining here. So we can see our individual cells that make up this larger villus structure, which is in the wall of the intestine. And then ultimately, you can see the vasculature in here and also the lymphatic vessels. These nutrients or these molecules go into the blood supply to be circulated to the rest of the body, and specifically the liver first, and then to the rest of the body. So in order to support this function of absorbing nutrients, the digestive system has four key processes. So the first thing is that the digestive system needs to transport the food to the areas of the digestive system where absorption takes place. And so this is a constant process or function that occurs throughout the whole digestive tract, in this case, the GI tract. And here you can see these blue squiggles right here that are indicating transport. So once food is ingested, it ends up in the lumen of this large tube. And so anything that is within this tube is technically outside of the body. So it's continuous with the external environment, but this external environment just happens to be surrounded by body cells. And so anything that stays in this tube all the way through the stomach, the intestines, and the colon, and then ultimately into the rectum, that is going to be excreted. So that's the thing the body doesn't want, and that's going to be excreted by feces, as feces. And so these transport processes are really important because one of the things I want to highlight is if you see these different colored arrows within this diagram, these are all the different digestive processes. And you'll note that these vary throughout different points in the digestive system. And so it's also important that food is transported so that these different specialized areas of the alimentary canal or the GI tract can perform their function. So two examples of transport processes are swallowing, which you can see animated here, and then peristalsis, which goes on throughout this tube, which is effectively pushing our large bolus or chunk of food through this tube all the way to the anus. And so here you can see it's achieved by sequential muscle contractions at different points in the GI tract. So we initially have a contraction here, and that contraction propagates, and it pushes this bolus of food along the GI tract, eventually excreting it back to the external world outside of the body. So the stuff that isn't excreted as feces is ultimately stuff that the body wants or absorbs into the body tissues and ultimately the bloodstream. So this includes nutrients, vitamins, and minerals. And so let me just address each of these in order, and we'll go into them more deeply as we move forward. So the first class, and probably the one we focus on more, and which is the one you should think of immediately when you think of digestion, are the macronutrients. So carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids, which are kind of subsets of carbohydrates. So these macronutrients are really the large molecules that are either broken down to produce energy and also or can be used as the building blocks for building up tissues and cells in the body. So we have our carbohydrates, which have classic structures. Here you can see a hexose sugar, meaning that it has 6 carbons at each of these vertices here in our hexagon, or a pentose or a 5-carbon sugar, again, 5 vertices. Each of those is a carbon molecule. And then those carbon molecules are bound to water. So you can see an H here and an OH here. So a carbon and 2 H's and an O would be a carbo carbohydrate where it's hydrated with water. And these carbohydrates can either be simple in the case of our monosaccharides, glucose and deoxyribose right here. So deoxyribose is a component of nucleic acids or nucleic acids. And then we have our larger branched carbohydrate, which is a complex one. Here, the example is glycogen, which is composed of multiple monomers of glucose all bound together in this branching structure. So this would be a polysaccharide or a polymer of carbohydrates. Here we have lipids. We talked about, or you reviewed lipids really early on in the class, recognizing that they're composed primarily of hydrocarbons. So you can see these white circles right here are hydrogens and the black circles are carbons. And here in our molecular stick diagram, each of these vertices is again a carbon and the hydrogens aren't shown. So it's just implied that these carbons, if there's not another bond, are bound to hydrogen. And so these are composed of large hydrocarbon chains. Carbon and hydrogen equally share electrons, so they tend to be nonpolar or not have charge differences in the molecules. And then finally, the most diverse and probably important class are the proteins. Here we have an amino acid, which forms a building block of a protein. As a reminder, the amino acids all have the same backbone, carbons, nitrogens, oxygens, and hydrogens. And then each different amino acid has a specialized R group branching off from the central carbon, which gives it unique chemical properties. These amino acids are bound together from N terminus to C terminus right here to form large amino acid chains, which are then proteins. And as these chains get larger and larger, they can fold into very complex functional structures, i.e. molecular machines that achieve functions throughout the body. So we go from amino acid, the building block, all the way up to very complex protein structures. So all of these, again, can be used to produce energy once they get to into the body and are utilized for metabolism, or they can be used to build cell structures like phospholipid membranes. This triglyceride can be broken down and reformulated, or say carbohydrates are often linked to the cell membrane and form this glycoprotein shell on the outside of this cell, which can be used to identify cells. And then obviously the proteins are the machines. The other things that are absorbed are vitamins, and we won't talk too much about vitamins because they're really organic compounds that are necessary for chemical reactions or physiological processes that occur in the body, but they're really just required in relatively small amounts and are more specifically applicable if you're looking at specific biochemistry or production or pathological conditions where somebody is not getting enough vitamins. So for instance, riboflavin, which is vitamin B2, is involved in FAD synthesis, which is important for metabolism, particularly in cellular respiration, and also red blood cell production. So you don't need much of it, but if you don't have it, these processes will not occur. And then minerals, which we've talked about a lot throughout the A and P sequence. So these are inorganic compounds that are necessary for physiological function. So sodium, which has so many functions, including nervous system function, absorption. So we'll talk about its role in absorption. We also have calcium, which we've talked about in terms of bone, muscle function, nervous function, and also general cellular function as a signaling molecule. And another example of a mineral, which is actually a metal, would be iron, which we talked about its importance in hemoglobin and binding oxygen, which links into the respiratory system. So we have our two initial processes are transport of food through the GI tract, and whatever is left over is stuff the body doesn't want. And then the stuff that actually gets into the body goes through this process of absorption and has to be microscopic in order to get into the body proper. In order for these molecules to be absorbed, they have to be small enough to get through the cells. And so that requires two additional processes, which is the breakdown of these larger food particles. And so the first process is physically breaking down things or mechanically breaking down nutrients. So here we have some shredded beef right here. And so I chose beef because when it's shredded, it shows kind of the stringy structure, which reflects the structure of the myofibril, or sorry, not the myofibrils, but the muscle fibers, which are the large cells that are packed full of protein, contractile proteins. And so that's what gives muscle its stringiness. But these are very large and interlinked together via various proteins and interactions. And so these muscle cells have to be physically broken down through chewing and other processes, which increases their surface area and allows more interaction of the digestive system with the individual proteins in these cells and molecules. So for instance, chewing will break down these plasma membranes and separate muscle fibers together. And here you can see some myoblasts here, which are muscle precursor cells, and you can see actually what these protein filaments, these are actin filaments that are stained in yellow. And then here we have the actual protein structure of portions of a myofibril. So these are going to be large proteins, and ultimately the mechanically breaking down will form these sort of large filamentous proteins, which will be floating around in the saliva and mucus in your stomach and your gut. This mechanical breakdown can include both ripping things apart physically, but also breaking non-atomic bonds, for instance, hydrogen bonds. So here, imagine this is a protein here, which is folded up, and this negative charge on the protein is interacting with this positively charged amino acid in another part of the protein. And so in order to increase the surface area of this molecule, this hydrogen bond needs to be broken so that it can form a linear chain, and that gives the body very good access to this protein in order to break it down chemically in order to get it into the individual monomers that can be absorbed through the cell or plasma membranes of the cells within the intestines. So that brings us to our final process of the digestive system, which is that these polymers, or large macronutrients composed of multiple subunits or monomers, are chemically digested, which involves breaking of chemical bonds, diagrammed with the solid black lines here. So here we have individual monomers. In this case, let's imagine these are amino acids, and this requires enzymes or chemical reactions to occur to separate the electrons from these two molecules and break an atomic bond. And in that process, we can get a smaller molecule, and through multiple enzymes working together, interacting with different atomic bonds, eventually we can break this down all the way to monomers, which are then small enough to be absorbed into the body proper by moving through the cell membrane. So the mechanical breakdown is kind of physically breaking down these large proteins in this case, and then the chemical digestion involves breaking of atomic bonds, not all of the atomic bonds, but the ones that make these building blocks small enough for the body to absorb. So if we look at the overview of the digestive processes, we can see that food is propelled or transported through the GI tract or the tube through the body. And in this process, those nutrients are absorbed after they are first mechanically broken down or digested, and then chemically broken down or digested, which is diagrammed in this process. Here we have our mechanical and chemical digestion, and we can see where things go through the gut. So I want to just conclude by talking a little bit about how these processes and functions link to the structure. And so the alimentary canal or gastrointestinal tract, GI tract, which I've been talking about, is the tube that transports food throughout the body, which is the structure diagrammed here. This is composed of many different parts. And so the thing I want to highlight, and you can see in this image, is these colored arrows are regionally specific within the GI tract. And so as we move through the GI tract, different areas or sections have different functions, which is reflected in their different structures and the demands on those areas. And so one of the things we'll be doing moving forward in the digestive system is looking at these different structures and seeing how they participate in the breakdown of macronutrients in order to get them transported through the system or small enough to be absorbed. So for instance, if we look at the oral cavity, it's involved in propulsion, so moving forward, and really every part of the GI tract is involved in propulsion, but also chemical digestion and mechanical digestion, for instance, chewing. But then as we get lower down, what you'll see is that absorption in orange right here is really focused in the intestines proper, and the stomach is marginal in terms of its absorptive capacities and what it actually absorbs. It's really not so significant except for a few vitamins. And so the intestines are really largely specialized for absorption. And we'll see this as we go through. And one of the things you want to focus on as you're going through the Saragos in the reading is thinking about how does the structure of this organ within the digestive system support its function, or what are those functions and how is that reflected in the structure? In addition to the GI tract, which is actually carrying the food, and as a reminder, the inside of the GI tract is outside of the body, we also have numerous accessory organs that are part of the digestive system that aren't directly part of the GI tract, but assist in digestion and directly interact or indirectly interact with the food within the alimentary canal. And so these accessory organs are the salivary glands up here near the oral cavity, the tongue, which has very intuitive functions, the liver, the gallbladder, and then ultimately the pancreas in yellow here. And so note these also have specialized function, and these specialized functions are also reflected in their structure and in their role of breaking down and digesting or moving food through the GI system. In summary, I provided an overview of digestive processes, and we'll look more at how individual organs within the digestive system execute and achieve these different processes, which support in the overall function of a digestion, which is getting stuff from outside of the body, specifically physical stuff with bulk to it, liquids and solids, into the body so that they can be utilized by the body for either energy production or building up. So this requires that the digestive system absorb nutrients, which requires that they first go from macroscopic to microscopic through the processes of mechanical breakdown and chemical digestion. And then if we look through the GI tract and accessory organs, they're all functionally specialized. And so this requires not only that the food be transported through the GI system, so anything the body doesn't want is excreted or removed from the internal cavity, which is continuous with the external environment, but also transported to the parts of the GI tract which effectively execute these different functions. And then as a reminder, whatever is not wanted is excreted, and whatever is wanted needs to be transported through this, from the lumen, through the membranes, the linings of the intestines or the stomach, in very specialized cases, into the blood proper so it can be circulated to the cells and tissues of the body.